In the spring of 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte confronted a predicament that even his formidable military genius could not conquer with an army. He desperately needed funds, not the typical revenues governments amass through taxes and trade, but an immense sum. This capital had to be acquired swiftly, discreetly, and from sources that would not raise alarm with the ever-vigilant British Navy. The British, acutely aware that wars are frequently decided in counting houses as much as on battlefields, meticulously monitored every financial transaction across the European continent. To address this urgent need, Napoleon made the momentous decision to sell Louisiana, a vast and undeveloped territory. This expansive land stretched from New Orleans in the south up to Canada, and from the Mississippi River westward to the formidable Rocky Mountains. Its sale to the United States, for a price of $15 million, encompassed roughly 830,000 square miles. By any contemporary standard, this was the largest real estate transaction in recorded history, effectively doubling the size of the fledgling United States through a single negotiation. Intriguingly, this deal was conducted by diplomats who, driven by necessity, moved with a speed that surpassed their government's initial authorizations. The true challenge, however, lay in the practicalities of the transaction. The United States Treasury, still in its early stages, did not possess $15 million in readily available cash. France, for its part, required payment in a form it could quickly utilize before the British inevitably sought to intervene. Furthermore, the physical transfer of the vast Louisiana territory could not be completed until the money actually changed hands. This immense sum then needed to traverse the Atlantic Ocean, which in 1803 was, to all intents and purposes, a British lake, dominated by the Royal Navy. Yet, amidst this perilous maritime landscape, a strategic financial pivot was required to bridge the gap between French necessity and American impossibility. The ingenious solution to this multifaceted problem was ultimately crafted in Amsterdam, within the venerable offices of a banking house known as Hope & Company. In 1803, Hope & Company stood as the most powerful private bank globally. While firms like the Baring brothers in London might have been larger by certain metrics, Hope & Company's true might lay in its unparalleled influence. Virtually no transaction of genuine geopolitical significance in the Western world during the late 18th and early 19th centuries reached fruition without their direct involvement, shrewd advice, or explicit orchestration. Their resume was staggering. They had financed numerous wars, extended credit to kings, and famously kept the vast Russian Empire financially solvent through periods of catastrophic military expenditure. They had successfully floated government bonds for nations that no other bank dared to touch, consistently reaping enormous profits in the process. Beyond mere financial services, Hope & Company operated an extensive network of commercial intelligence. This encompassed vital information on commodity prices, unfolding political developments, military movements, and the fluctuating financial conditions across Europe. An information system that, in the pre-telegraph era, was among the most sophisticated and comprehensive in the Western world. It was this powerhouse institution that, in 1803, engineered the financing for the Louisiana Purchase. This singular transaction fundamentally reshaped the North American continent, fundamentally securing the future trajectory of the United States and effectively ending France's significant imperial aspirations in North America. Moreover, its financial architecture was considered a masterpiece of early modern banking ingenuity. Yet, the Louisiana Purchase, momentous as it was, represents only the most celebrated achievement of Hope & Company. The comprehensive saga of the Hope family and the formidable bank they meticulously constructed remains largely overlooked by conventional history books. Their story, far from beginning in Amsterdam, originates in a small Scottish town. It winds its way through the commercial explosion that followed the Dutch Golden Age, navigates the tumultuous eras of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, intricately shaping the financial architecture of the early modern world. This epic narrative eventually concludes in a quiet, almost unnoticed dissolution, leaving barely a trace of the institution that had, for nearly a century, functioned as the undisputed financial center of the Western world. This is that untold story. But how did a family of Scottish outsiders manage to occupy the helm of Europe's most powerful financial engine by 1803? To understand the magnitude of the Louisiana financing, one must first travel back a century, to a time when Amsterdam reigned as the undisputed financial capital of the world, and the Hope family was just beginning its ascent. Our journey begins in Amsterdam, circa 1700. By this time, the Dutch Republic had begun its long and gradual decline from the apex of commercial dominance it had enjoyed in the mid-17th century. The legendary Golden Age, which had transformed Amsterdam into the wealthiest city on earth, the vibrant heart of a global trading empire built upon the spice trade, the tragic slave trade, and the pioneering financial innovations of the Dutch East India Company, was perceptibly waning. Nevertheless, the immense capital painstakingly accumulated during that extraordinary century did not simply vanish as commercial supremacy shifted. Instead, it concentrated, seeking new avenues and vehicles for investment. In the hands of the right institutions, this capital evolved into something far more powerful and enduring than the trading empire that initially generated it. Even in 1700, Amsterdam remained the unchallenged financial capital of the world, a status that London had not yet fully achieved and Paris would never attain. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, established in 1609, had laid the essential groundwork for modern international finance. It had introduced standardized exchange rates, developed sophisticated credit instruments, and pioneered the institutional mechanisms that allowed money to move reliably and efficiently across borders and between different currencies, an unprecedented level of financial fluidity no other city could yet match. The Dutch had either invented or, at the very least, systematized many of the fundamental financial instruments that continue to structure global commerce today, including the tradable share, the modern bond market, the forward contract, the options market, and the practice of short selling. It was into this sophisticated and dynamic environment, sometime in the early 18th century, that a family of Scottish merchants named Hope arrived. The precise origins of the Hope family in the Netherlands are somewhat veiled in obscurity. Scottish merchants had, of course, maintained active trade relationships with the Dutch Republic for generations. However, the exact circumstances that led the Hope family to settle permanently in Amsterdam, rather than maintaining intermittent trade links, are not entirely clear from surviving historical records. What is evident is that by the early decades of the 18th century, the Hope family had firmly established themselves as serious and active participants within Amsterdam's esteemed merchant community. They engaged in robust trade of cloth, various commodities, and the very financial instruments that Amsterdam had come to specialize in, thereby diligently cultivating the commercial relationships and the reputation for reliability that were absolutely essential prerequisites for advancement in that highly competitive world. The progenitor of what would evolve into the formidable Hope and Company banking dynasty was Thomas Hope, the Scottish merchant who took root in Amsterdam in the early 18th century. He hailed from a family of minor Scottish landowners and merchants, a background that afforded comfort and respectability, but certainly not significant wealth. Crucially, what Thomas brought to Amsterdam was not a substantial amount of capital, but rather something that, in the specific context of early 18th century Dutch commerce, proved even more valuable: exceptional commercial intelligence. He possessed an innate ability to discern lucrative opportunities that others had yet to identify. However, intelligence alone was insufficient. He recognized early on that navigating the complex Dutch financial ecosystem required a foundation of unimpeachable character. Furthermore, he possessed a distinct kind of personal trustworthiness, a quality indispensable for a newcomer seeking to build a robust network of relationships within a community that did not automatically extend trust to outsiders. Thomas Hope eventually had 3 sons, Archibald, Thomas Jr., and Adrian. It was the combined force of their efforts, spanning the early and middle decades of the 18th century, that gradually transformed their modest merchant operation into an entity that would ultimately become the most powerful private bank in all of Europe. This profound transformation unfolded in the manner typical of most significant shifts, gradually, then suddenly. Years of patient, diligent relationship building and incremental capital accumulation were followed by a pivotal moment when their scale tipped decisively from merely respectable to undeniably dominant. Suddenly, the bank found itself occupying a position that its competitors simply could not easily challenge, largely because they had not been present for the decades of painstaking work that had culminated in such an formidable advantage. By the 1760s, Hope & Company had evolved beyond being merely a merchant house that also happened to conduct banking activities. It had, unequivocally, become a bank, the bank, by Amsterdam's discerning standards of the term. While it maintained its extensive merchant relationships, these were now primarily leveraged as invaluable sources of commercial intelligence and consistent business flow. This transition was not marked by any single dramatic event. Instead, it was the cumulative result of a series of strategic decisions, each perhaps modest in isolation, but which collectively repositioned the firm squarely at the center of European finance in a remarkably durable fashion. To truly grasp how Hope & Company ascended to such prominence and comprehend the unparalleled institution they built, one must first understand the unique world in which they operated. This was an era where banking was far from being a regulated, transparent, or institutionalized activity. Rather, it was a profoundly personal endeavor. Trust in this environment was not a mere byproduct of legal enforcement. It served as the primary currency of commercial life. Moreover, the boundary between private wealth and state finance was not a sharply defined line, but rather a blurred zone where the most significant and consequential transactions invariably occurred. While the foundation had been laid by the elder Hopes, it was the arrival of a specific individual in the 1750s, a nephew named Henry, that would ignite the firm's transformation from a respected merchant house into the undisputed titan of international finance. Ironically, the most important figure in the early history of Hope & Company was not its founder, Thomas Hope, but his nephew, Henry Hope. Henry joined the firm in the 1750s, and over the ensuing 4 decades, he would utterly transform it into something truly unprecedented in the annals of European finance. Henry Hope was born in Boston, Massachusetts, in 1735 into a branch of the Hope family that had previously emigrated and settled in New England. His father was a prosperous Boston merchant, comfortably established and possessing the kind of extensive transatlantic commercial connections that characterized successful colonial trading families of the mid-18th century. Henry received a practical commercial education, typical for sons of merchant families during that era. This involved apprenticeships and hands-on training in the intricate mechanics of trade and finance, leading to the gradual acquisition of deep commercial knowledge through direct participation in business operations, rather than through formal schooling. When he arrived in Amsterdam in the 1750s, he brought with him more than just commercial training. He possessed a remarkable set of personal qualities that proved perfectly suited to the specific demands of the world he was entering. These included an extraordinary memory for names, intricate relationships, and minute commercial details, an unusual ability to assess creditworthiness and risk through astute personal observation, rather than relying solely on formal financial analysis, a social ease that allowed him to effortlessly navigate between the elite Dutch commercial aristocracy, the sophisticated European diplomatic world, and the diverse international merchant community without ever seeming out of place, and an almost insatiable appetite for work that his contemporaries found remarkable, even by the standards of an era that generally did not perceive overwork as a problem. He also possessed a quality that is challenging to categorize precisely, yet one that contemporaries consistently noted. He was genuinely trustworthy in a way that transcended mere reliability. In a business environment where the paramount risk wasn't market fluctuation, but the fundamental failure of counterparties to honor their commitments, Hope & Company, under Henry's decisive leadership, became widely known as an institution that would consistently deliver on its promises, irrespective of the prevailing circumstances, any inconvenience incurred, or even whether the specific commitment was legally enforceable. This unimpeachable reputation was not built overnight. It was the hard-won product of years of countless transactions, both large and small, in which the firm consistently chose the path that safeguarded and enhanced its reputation, even when an alternative course might have offered more immediate financial profit. The cumulative value of that meticulously accumulated reputation, while not easily quantifiable in the context of any single transaction, was in the aggregate worth far more than any specific deal. It was this reputational currency that would soon transform Hope and Company into the primary gatekeeper of European state finance. This was because it fundamentally determined the very nature of the transactions the firm was invited to participate in, and critically, the favorable terms on which those transactions were subsequently offered. By the 1760s, Hope and Company had firmly established itself as the preferred financial intermediary for a wide array of European governments desperately needing to borrow money in the sophisticated Amsterdam capital market. In the mid-18th century, the Amsterdam market was globally recognized as the largest and most advanced bond market in the world. It was a vital hub where governments, burgeoning trading companies, and large commercial enterprises could efficiently raise capital from a broad and deep base of Dutch investors. These investors, having participated for generations in the world's first truly mature capital market, had developed a profound understanding of credit risk and possessed a genuine appetite for the attractive yields offered by government lending. The precise mechanics of how this system operated are particularly worth understanding, not only because they were genuinely innovative for their time, but also because they laid down foundational patterns that continue to structure international capital markets even today. A government in need of funds, be it Denmark, Sweden, Russia, or any of the numerous other European states that routinely operated with significant deficits during the 18th century, would typically approach Hope and Company with a request for a loan. The bank would then rigorously assess the creditworthiness of the potential borrower, skillfully negotiate the intricate terms of the loan, and subsequently issue bonds. These bonds, essentially securities, representing the right to receive periodic interest payments and the eventual repayment of the principal, would then be sold to eager Dutch investors. Crucially, the investors bore the ultimate risk regarding the government's eventual ability to repay the debt. Hope and Company, in turn, earned a fee for expertly arranging the entire transaction. This fee typically comprised a percentage of the total amount raised, along with ongoing fees for meticulously managing the interest payments and carefully maintaining the vital relationship between the borrowing government and the discerning investor community. The bank's own capital was not directly at risk in these primary transactions. They served as astute intermediaries, not as direct lenders. However, their reputation, a commodity worth considerably more than their capital, was absolutely at risk. This meant that their continued viability in the business hinged entirely on the fact that the borrowers they introduced to the Amsterdam market actually honored their debts. This structure created a powerful alignment of incentives. Hope and Company had every compelling reason to be exceptionally selective about which governments they agreed to represent because their very standing and credibility within the Amsterdam market depended directly on the successful performance of every single loan they had arranged. A government that defaulted on bonds placed in Amsterdam would not only damage its own credit, but would also severely tarnish the impeccable reputation of the bank that had vouched for it. Consequently, Hope and Company applied remarkably rigorous standards for their era to the assessment of potential borrowers. They were notably willing to decline business, even from governments offering substantial fees, if they judged those entities to be insufficiently creditworthy. This very selectivity, in itself, functioned as a potent form of marketing. Those governments that Hope and Company did agree to represent benefited immensely from the implicit endorsement that came with such an association. If the most demanding and highly reputable bank in Amsterdam was willing to bring a government's bonds to market, the discerning Amsterdam investing community drew its own favorable conclusions about that government's creditworthiness. The bank's imprimatur was a clear and valuable signal, a signal worth tangible money to every borrower who received it. By the 1770s, Hope and Company was consistently arranging loans for an impressive roster of European governments, including Russia, Austria, Sweden, Denmark, Portugal, and a range of smaller European states. The sheer volume of business conducted was enormous by the standards of the era. The resulting fee income was substantial, but perhaps even more valuable was the stream of intelligence that flowed through the bank, critical information about which governments were solvent and which were struggling, which political situations were stable and which were precarious, and which commercial opportunities were emerging or declining. This intelligence in itself constituted a competitive advantage of incalculable worth. In this period, Henry Hope emerged as one of the most extraordinarily well-connected private individuals in all of Europe. This wasn't because he actively sought political influence for its own sake, but because the very nature of international banking on such a grand scale demanded intimate relationships with the key decision-makers on matters of war, peace, taxation, trade policy, and government borrowing. One simply could not arrange a major loan for the Russian government without first cultivating a deep relationship with the individuals who effectively ran it. Similarly, placing Swedish bonds in the Amsterdam market necessitated a profound understanding of Swedish politics to accurately assess whether the issuing government would realistically still be in power in 5 years' time. This was, in essence, banking as an advanced form of intelligence work, and Henry Hope proved to be extraordinarily adept at it. From their modest beginnings as merchant outsiders in the early 18th century, the Hope family had successfully ascended to the center of the financial world. By the mid-1700s, this once small operation was no longer merely observing history. They were actively funding the very empires that were writing it. With the stage set and the financial mechanisms in place, the alliance between the House of Hope and Baring Brothers was prepared to execute a transaction that would serve as the ultimate test of their combined financial ingenuity. Of all the myriad relationships that Hope and Company meticulously cultivated during the late 18th century, none proved more consequential, more lucrative, or more strategically significant than their profound connection with the burgeoning Russian Empire. Russia, under the formidable reign of Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, was a nation simultaneously undergoing a period of vast military expansion and experiencing financial stress of truly extraordinary proportions. Catherine's ambitions were imperial in every conceivable sense. She waged costly wars against the Ottoman Empire, aggressively expanding Russian territory southward to the crucial Black Sea coast and eastward deep into Siberia. She orchestrated, alongside Frederick the Great of Prussia and Maria Theresa of Austria, a series of partitions that ultimately absorbed vast swaths of Poland. Furthermore, she maintained an opulent court at St. Petersburg, deliberately designed to project an image of refined European grandeur, thereby commanding respect from the Western powers that Russia simultaneously sought as allies and feared as rivals. All these monumental endeavors came at a staggering cost, enormous amounts of money. The Russian taxation system, operating within an economy still overwhelmingly agrarian and whose vast peasant population lived under the severely limiting conditions of serfdom, simply could not generate the immense revenues that Catherine's boundless ambitions demanded. The inevitable result was a chronic fiscal deficit, which Catherine attempted to manage through a dual strategy: currency inflation, which provided short-term relief but created significant medium-term problems, and extensive foreign borrowing. For Russia in the 1760s and 1770s, foreign borrowing invariably meant turning to Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, for Russia, it meant turning to Hope and Company. The very first major Russian loan, expertly arranged through Hope and Company, occurred in 1769 amidst the throes of the First Russo-Turkish War. Russia urgently required funds to finance its military operations against the Ottoman Empire, a conflict that Catherine had deliberately initiated with the long-term strategic objective of securing crucial access to the Black Sea, and eventually gaining control over Constantinople and the vital straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The grand strategic objective was crystal clear. The immediate problem, however, was acutely financial. Hope and Company skillfully arranged a loan amounting to several million guilders, meticulously placing Russian bonds with Amsterdam investors. The terms, reflecting the genuine risk of lending to a government with a limited track record in the international capital market and currently embroiled in an expensive military conflict, were, by later standards, not particularly favorable to Russia. Interest rates were high, the issuance discount was substantial, and the fees charged by the bank were considerable. Yet, Russia had very few viable alternatives. Having thoroughly assessed the creditworthiness of the Russian state and concluding that Catherine's government was sufficiently stable and genuinely committed to servicing its debts, Hope and Company was willing to stake its invaluable reputation on the success of the transaction. The loan was repaid in full. The Russian bonds performed as expected. The Amsterdam investors who had purchased them received their interest payments precisely on schedule and eventually their principal. Hope and Company's astute judgment, its willingness to vouch for Russia in a market that might otherwise have been deeply skeptical, was unequivocally vindicated. From that initial success, the relationship deepened dramatically. Over the subsequent 2 decades, Hope and Company pumped an unfathomable 53 million guilders into the Russian Empire to bankroll Catherine the Great's relentless ambitions. Each successive loan built upon the trust established by the last. The successful repayment of prior borrowings progressively cemented Russia's creditworthiness in the Amsterdam market, gradually allowing for a reduction in the interest rates Russia needed to pay and consistently improving the overall terms on which it could borrow. The relationship between the bank and the Russian government steadily evolved into something far more profound than a mere series of commercial transactions. It blossomed into a deep partnership, an ongoing arrangement in which Hope and Company served as Russia's primary financial agent in the Western European capital markets, complete with all the unparalleled access and invaluable information that such a pivotal role inherently provided. The bank's representative stationed in St. Petersburg, a position that rotated among trusted agents and partners over the years, was, in practical terms, one of the most important financial officials in Russia. Even though this individual held no official government position, they enjoyed direct access to the key decision-makers shaping Russian financial policy. They possessed privileged information concerning Russian military plans, diplomatic intentions, and prevailing economic conditions that was available to almost no other private individual in Western Europe. Furthermore, this representative was strategically positioned to offer expert advice when sought, advice that frequently shaped the crucial financial decisions of one of the most powerful governments in the world. This flow of invaluable information was by no means unidirectional. The insights Hope and Company gleaned from its profound Russian relationship actively informed and enhanced its operations in every other market it participated in. For instance, understanding Russian military intentions in the Ottoman theater was directly relevant to accurately assessing Ottoman creditworthiness. Similarly, comprehending Russia's diplomatic positioning during the complex negotiations over the Polish partition was crucial for evaluating the financial conditions of Austria and Prussia. In a very real sense, the bank was operating a sophisticated private intelligence service, not through covert espionage, but through the systematic cultivation of deep, information-rich relationships that its unique commercial position made possible. Armed with this unparalleled intelligence network, Hope and Company transformed from lenders into master architects of international financial markets. He sought to maximize their influence by embedding the bank into the infrastructure of global trade monopolies. Thomas Hope, the co-founder, strategically maneuvered himself into the boardrooms of both the Dutch East and West India companies, effectively embedding the bank into the heart of global trade monopolies. Their financial tentacles reached far beyond European borders. When the Portuguese crown desperately needed a bailout, Hope and Company didn't just ask for cash interest. They demanded and received a highly lucrative monopoly on the sale of diamonds mined by enslaved people in the Brazilian province of Minas Gerais, single-handedly turning Amsterdam into the diamond capital of Europe. However, this strategic expansion occasionally led to high-stakes ventures, most notably in attempts to corner commodity markets, which proved costly. In a covert attempt to corner the global market for Mexican cochineal, a highly prized red dye, the firm lost millions of guilders between 1787 and 1794. Yet, like true apex predators of finance, they quickly recovered these staggering losses by ruthlessly buying up deeply discounted Polish bonds right after the country was violently partitioned, turning a geopolitical tragedy into a massive financial windfall. Catherine the Great, a shrewd and pragmatic monarch, fully understood this dynamic. On several occasions, she corresponded directly with Henry Hope, an unusual mark of personal attention from a sovereign who, in normal circumstances, dealt exclusively through official diplomatic channels. Their correspondence was not purely commercial in nature. Catherine was a genuinely sophisticated political operator who keenly understood that those who controlled capital wielded a form of power that, while distinct from military or political might, was nonetheless equally potent and real. She treated Henry Hope as a strategic peer, not merely a financier. While the rigid distinctions of rank in the 18th century precluded treating him as a social equal, she clearly recognized him as someone whose astute judgment and invaluable goodwill were well worth cultivating for their own inherent strategic value. The relationship with Russia also produced one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of Hope and Company: the intricate negotiations surrounding the purchase of Empress Catherine the Great's vast art collection. Catherine was a truly voracious art collector, undeniably one of the most significant connoisseurs and accumulators of the 18th century. She meticulously assembled in St. Petersburg a collection so extensive it would eventually become the world-renowned Hermitage Museum. Her method involved acquiring art through agents stationed across Europe, often purchasing entire collections when they became available on the market. Catherine's insatiable appetite for acquisition was notably unconstrained by price. When major collections emerged in the 1760s and 1770s, Catherine was typically the most aggressive bidder. These high-stakes transactions frequently involved Hope and Company in a crucial role as a financial intermediary, arranging payments, managing the complex logistics of transferring artworks, and occasionally extending short-term credit to facilitate purchases that exceeded Catherine's immediately available liquid funds. This symbiotic relationship between Hope and Company and Russia proved enduring, outlasting Catherine the Great herself. It continued through the reign of Paul I and well into the reign of Alexander I in the early 19th century. By the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the bank's deep Russian connection had matured over 35 years, generating substantial revenues, fostering invaluable relationships, and establishing information flows that collectively made it one of the most critical commercial assets in European finance. However, the Russian relationship was only one facet of the formidable financial empire Hope and Company had meticulously constructed. To fully grasp the context of the Louisiana Purchase, one must also understand the bank's other foundational partnership, its profound connection to the Baring Brothers of London, and, through that alliance, its central role in the financial architecture of the Anglo-American world. For while the Russian connection provided the bank's continental reach, it was the partnership with London's Baring Brothers that would bridge the chasm between European capital and the burgeoning American frontier. Francis Baring established Baring Brothers Hope and Company in London in 1762. He was the son of a German wool merchant who had immigrated to England, a man whose commercial origins, rather than aristocratic lineage, defined his ascent. He built his firm using the same potent combination of intelligence, unwavering reliability, and strategic network building that had characterized Henry Hope's development of the Amsterdam operation. The two firms, Hope and Company in Amsterdam and Baring Brothers in London, were natural partners, occupying complementary positions within the intricate European financial system. Hope and Company held sway over the continental capital markets, especially the Amsterdam market, which remained the primary source of long-term government lending throughout the late 18th century. Meanwhile, Barings was solidifying its position in the burgeoning London market and in the increasingly vital trade finance business that linked Britain to its rapidly expanding global commercial empire. The personal relationship between Henry Hope and Francis Baring flourished in the 1780s and 1790s, evolving into an unusually close bond by the standards of business relationships of that era. They corresponded regularly, sharing vital commercial intelligence and referring business to each other whenever a transaction demanded capabilities or connections that one firm possessed and the other lacked. This consistent collaboration gradually fostered a deep mutual trust, which, in the banking world of that period, was the very bedrock of a genuine commercial partnership. The alliance was further cemented, not just by commercial ties, but also by family bonds. In 1796, Henry Hope's nephew and trusted partner, Alexander Hope, married into the Baring family circle. This specific connection formally brought the two firms into a familial relationship, reinforcing their commercial partnership with the kinship ties that 18th century business culture considered essential for the deepest forms of commercial trust. The Hope-Baring alliance was far more than a mere convenience for the two firms. In the specific context of late 18th and early 19th century European finance, it constituted a genuinely formidable commercial force. Between them, the two firms commanded access to virtually every major capital market in the Western world: Amsterdam, London, and through their respective networks, the capital markets of Hamburg, Frankfurt, Paris, and the emerging American market that was taking shape as the young United States established its financial institutions. Collectively, they also maintained relationships with virtually every major government in the Western world. Barings was diligently cultivating its connections to the United States government, a relationship that would eventually designate it as the official financial agent of the United States in Europe, a prestigious position it would hold for decades. Hope and Company meticulously maintained its existing relationships with the Russian, Austrian, Swedish, and other continental governments. Together, they represented something akin to a private monopoly on the arrangement of large-scale government borrowing in the Western world. While not a formal monopoly, other banks, financial intermediaries, and houses certainly participated in government lending. The unique combination of unparalleled reputation, an extensive relationship network, ready access to capital, and superior commercial intelligence that Hope and Company and Barings jointly possessed was, in practice, a barrier to competition. Few transactions of genuine scale could circumvent their combined influence. This powerful alliance also possessed a significant geopolitical dimension that neither firm could entirely control. The late 18th century was a period of extraordinary political instability across Europe. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars successively shattered the established political order within which European banking had traditionally operated. This tumultuous environment created unprecedented risks, new opportunities, and immense demands on the financial institutions embedded within that order. The French Revolution, commencing in 1789, presented Hope and Company with an immediate and severe challenge. Amsterdam was geographically proximate to France, politically intertwined through the intricate network of European diplomacy, and commercially exposed to French disruption due to its extensive lending operations. The revolutionary government in Paris displayed hostility toward the international banking establishment in ways that extended far beyond mere rhetoric. It defaulted on French government debts, confiscated private property, and cultivated a political environment where the very relationships and trust networks that Hope and Company depended upon suddenly became perilous. In 1795, French revolutionary forces invaded the Dutch Republic. The old Dutch government was replaced by the Batavian Republic, a French client state. Amsterdam's long-held status as a neutral commercial center, which had been a cornerstone of its financial dominance, was effectively destroyed. Hope and Company, which had long operated on the assumption of a stable Dutch political environment, suddenly found itself in a country that was now a French dependency, subject to French financial policy and political directives. In response, Henry Hope made a strategic decision that showcased both his acute commercial intelligence and his sound political judgment. He left Amsterdam. He carefully relocated his most essential records, his key personnel, and as much of the firm's liquid assets as he could move, temporarily establishing operations in London. The firm continued to function, maintaining a presence in Amsterdam through trusted agents, while its principals managed the most sensitive operations from British territory. This marked a definitive shift in the firm's center of gravity. Henry Hope died in London in 1811 at the age of 75, never having returned to Amsterdam as a permanent resident. He had dedicated over 50 years to building the prestigious institution that bore his name. The firm then passed to the next generation, to partners who had been meticulously trained in the Hope tradition, but who faced a world that, in several critical respects, differed dramatically from the one in which that tradition had been forged. The Louisiana Purchase, which had transpired 8 years before Henry's death, stood as the capstone of his illustrious career. It was the transaction that most fully demonstrated what Hope and Company, at the zenith of its powers, was capable of orchestrating. To fully comprehend that monumental transaction, one must appreciate the complex financial and political context of 1803, a period that ranks as one of the most complicated moments in European history. By 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte had consolidated his power, making himself first consul of France, effectively the ruler of the country with a political authority that far exceeded any formal title he yet held. He was only 32 years old, yet already the most consequential military and political figure in Europe since Frederick the Great. His armies had decisively defeated Austria, humiliated Prussia, and compelled Britain to sign a peace treaty, the Peace of Amiens, in March 1802, which both sides recognized as a temporary cessation of hostilities, rather than a genuine, lasting resolution. Napoleon's vision for France was exceptionally comprehensive and coherent, unlike the more fragmented visions of his predecessors. He was determined to rebuild France as the dominant power in Europe, economically, militarily, and culturally. He intended to establish a rationalized legal and administrative framework, famously known as the Napoleonic Code, which would modernize French institutions and serve as a model for the territories that France was acquiring or influencing across the continent. Crucially, he also envisioned building a French empire in the Americas. This ambitious plan hinged on utilizing the vast Louisiana territory, which Spain had secretly ceded back to France in the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800. Louisiana was intended to serve as the agricultural hinterland for a lucrative Caribbean empire centered on Saint-Domingue, the immensely valuable French colony occupying the western portion of the island of Hispaniola. Saint-Domingue, known today as Haiti, was, in 1800, the most productive colony in the entire world. Its sugar plantations, worked by enslaved Africans under conditions of extraordinary brutality, generated revenues that made it more economically valuable to France than all of continental North America combined. Napoleon's strategic plan was to leverage Louisiana as the food-producing base that would feed Saint-Domingue's enslaved population, thereby freeing the island's own agricultural capacity for the maximum possible production of highly profitable export crops. However, this grand plan for a Caribbean empire collapsed in the Caribbean itself before it could ever be fully implemented on the North American continent. In 1791, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue had risen in revolt, marking the only truly successful slave revolution in history and the largest slave uprising since Spartacus. The Haitian Revolution, a brutal conflict that spanned 13 years, involved not only the enslaved population, but also the complex racial and class politics of colonial society, the competing interventions of Britain and Spain, and eventually the direct military engagement of Napoleon's own forces. Napoleon dispatched a large expedition to the island in 1801 under the command of his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc. Leclerc's expedition proved to be a catastrophe. Yellow fever claimed the lives of more French soldiers than the Haitian forces did. Toussaint Louverture, the brilliant revolutionary leader, was captured through treachery and subsequently died in a French prison. Yet his capture did not extinguish the resistance. Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe continued the fight with unwavering determination. By late 1802, Napoleon's Caribbean empire was effectively finished. The forces he had sent to Saint-Domingue were being decimated by disease and combat. The colony that was intended to be the commercial heart of his American empire had instead become a consuming insurrection, devouring men and money without generating any of the expected revenue. It was in this dire context that Napoleon made the momentous decision to sell Louisiana. The vast territory of Louisiana was strategically valuable only as a support system for Saint-Domingue. Without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana remained a vast, largely unmapped territory that France could not effectively defend against burgeoning British naval power or aggressive American westward expansion. Holding onto it would demand ongoing military expenditure while generating no immediate commercial revenue. The sensible, financially rational course of action was to convert the territory into much-needed cash that could be immediately deployed for the European wars, which Napoleon correctly perceived as the primary theater for his ambitions. The precarious peace of Amiens was already unraveling by early 1803. Britain and France were inexorably moving towards renewed conflict over issues such as Malta, French influence in the Italian states, and a multitude of other specific disputes. These disagreements were, in essence, manifestations of the fundamental incompatibility between a Britain committed to maintaining the balance of power in Europe and a France committed to achieving absolute dominance over it. War was unequivocally coming, and Napoleon desperately needed money. The American negotiators in Paris, James Monroe, who had been specifically dispatched by President Jefferson to assist the regular minister, Robert Livingston, arrived in April 1803. They anticipated negotiating solely for the purchase of New Orleans, the crucial port city controlling the mouth of the Mississippi River, which was absolutely essential to American commerce in the interior of the continent. They had been authorized to spend up to $10 million for New Orleans and as much of the Florida territory as France could be persuaded to include in the deal. However, Napoleon's astute foreign minister, Talleyrand, presented them with a startling counteroffer. All of Louisiana, a staggering 830,000 square miles, for $15 million. Monroe and Livingston, dramatically exceeding their authorized limits, promptly agreed. This monumental agreement, however, immediately created a significant practical problem. The United States simply did not possess $15 million available in its treasury. France, for its part, needed the money quickly, before the imminent renewal of war with Britain created insurmountable complications. Furthermore, any financial transaction of this immense size in 1803 necessitated the deep involvement of the banking system in ways that the governments directly involved could not manage on their own. It was at this critical juncture that Hope and Company and Baring Brothers entered the picture, providing the crucial financial expertise. As the dust settled on the Napoleonic era and the firm returned to Amsterdam, it faced a world fundamentally different from the one that had witnessed its meteoric rise. The era of the private merchant banker was waning, and the long, quiet fade had begun. The financial structure of the Louisiana Purchase was, in its essential mechanics, a brilliant exercise in creative banking that ingeniously solved several apparently contradictory requirements simultaneously. France urgently needed cash, immediately usable funds that could directly finance military operations in Europe. The United States needed to pay $15 million that it did not have readily available in its treasury. Moreover, the entire transaction needed to be completed expeditiously before the inevitable renewal of Anglo-French hostilities created insurmountable legal or practical complications. Britain, as a belligerent power, might well argue that facilitating financial transfers to France constituted trading with the enemy, a position that would create enormous legal and reputational difficulties for any bank involved. The ingenious solution developed by Hope and Company and Barings worked as follows. The United States would issue bonds, securities paying 6% interest annually, with a total face value of $11.25 million. These bonds would be delivered directly to France as payment for Louisiana. The remaining $3.75 million of the $15 million purchase price would be used to settle American claims against France, stemming from French interference with American shipping during the undeclared quasi-war of 1798 to 1800. However, these American bonds were not immediately useful to France. Napoleon needed hard cash, not interest-bearing securities that would generate income over time. The crucial role of Hope and Company and Barings was to purchase these American bonds from France immediately, but at a discount to their face value. This discount reflected the time value of money and, importantly, the credit risk associated with the young American Republic. They would then convert these bonds into the immediate cash that France desperately needed. While textbooks often paint the Louisiana Purchase as an elegant triumph of diplomacy, the reality behind closed doors was a ruthless financial double-cross. Hope and Company and Barings were not about to shoulder this monumental risk alone. To protect their empire, they quietly pulled in other Amsterdam powerhouses, De Smet and Willink, to spread the exposure. Then, they squeezed a desperate Napoleon. Knowing the First Consul needed immediate cash for his looming war with Britain, the bankers purchased the newly issued American bonds at a steep discount of 87.5 cents on the dollar. France was forced to absorb a staggering 8 million franc discount, while Hope and Company quietly pocketed over 2.1 million francs in commissions and fees. When the dust settled, out of the $11.25 million in bonds the U.S. issued for the territory, Napoleon walked away with barely $8.8 million in hard cash. But the ultimate twist of the knife was how those funds were weaponized. Even as Britain and France teetered on the edge of all-out war, Hope and Company extended a massive 12 million franc credit line to France at Baltic seaports. These funds were specifically used by Napoleon to buy naval supplies and rebuild the French fleet. Think about that. A financial consortium anchored by London's own Barings Bank was actively financing the reconstruction of the very navy designed to destroy Britain. It wasn't just a real estate deal. It was a masterclass in playing both sides of a global war. The young American Republic had demonstrated its burgeoning ability to honor large financial commitments. Hope and Company and Barings had, in turn, demonstrated their unparalleled capacity to facilitate transactions of profound geopolitical significance, even under conditions of extraordinary complexity. The enduring relationship between American government finance and these leading London and Amsterdam banking houses would profoundly shape American fiscal policy for the first half of the 19th century. The Louisiana Purchase was not merely the largest real estate transaction in history. It was a powerful demonstration of what private banking, operating at its highest level of sophistication, could accomplish. It involved arranging a deal that no government could have managed on its own, navigating conditions that no normal commercial logic could have successfully addressed, and ultimately yielded consequences that fundamentally shaped the modern world. The Louisiana Purchase was completed in 1804. Yet, even as this masterpiece of finance was finalized, the geopolitical foundations upon which the firm's power rested were already beginning to fracture under the weight of an expanding European conflict. By that time, the very world in which Hope and Company had built its formidable power was already being dismantled by forces that no banking house, however sophisticated, could fully control. The Napoleonic Wars, which began in earnest with the renewal of Anglo-French conflict in 1803 and would not conclude until Waterloo in 1815, created conditions of extraordinary difficulty for any institution that depended on the free movement of goods, capital, and information across European borders. The continental system, which Napoleon imposed in 1806, represented a drastic attempt to entirely blockade Britain from European trade, explicitly prohibiting any territory under French control or influence from trading with Britain or receiving British goods. While imperfectly enforced, this system generated enormous resentment among European economies heavily dependent on British trade. Crucially, it severely and prolonged disrupted the commercial networks that European banking, especially in cities like Amsterdam, relied upon. Amsterdam, already under French occupation since 1795 and formally incorporated into the French Empire in 1810, was particularly hard hit. The city that had for a century been the undisputed commercial center of the world, witnessed a catastrophic collapse in its trade as the continental system severed its vital connections to Britain and to the broader Atlantic trading world that British commercial power had largely organized. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, which had been the institutional foundation of Dutch financial supremacy, was effectively destroyed. The once great merchant houses that had propelled Amsterdam to prominence either failed outright, relocated, or survived in a significantly diminished form that bore little resemblance to their former glory. Hope and Company survived, but crucially, it did not survive in Amsterdam. The firm's senior partners, astutely recognizing that Amsterdam under French occupation was no longer a viable base for the kind of international banking they practiced, had progressively shifted the core of their operations to London in the years following the French invasion of 1795. Henry Hope himself had been residing in London since the late 1790s. The London operation, managed in close coordination with Barings, meticulously maintained the firm's capacity to operate in the international capital markets, even as its Amsterdam base was effectively paralyzed. This survival strategy demanded delicate navigation of the complex political and legal intricacies of operating a firm with strong Dutch origins in a world gripped by Napoleonic conflict. Hope and Company found itself navigating a perilous dual existence. Its formal legal identity and primary physical presence were based in Amsterdam, a territory then under French occupation, while much of its operational capacity, particularly for engaging with international capital markets, had shifted to British territory. The paradoxical situation of Hope and Company, a Dutch bank with significant London operations and a French-occupied headquarters, simultaneously conducting business with warring governments on both sides of the Napoleonic conflict, was, to describe it mildly, extraordinarily intricate. This precarious balancing act kept the firm's lawyers exceptionally busy and underscored the indispensable role of its extensive political connections across all factions. The partners who steered Hope and Company through the turbulent Napoleonic era represented the second and third generations of leadership, not the original founders. Henry Hope, the visionary patriarch, was nearing the end of his life and passed away in 1811. The firm's management fell to men rigorously trained in the established Hope tradition, but confronted with a set of circumstances that tradition had never prepared them for. Paramount among these new leaders was Pierre César Labouchere, a figure of remarkable foresight and skill. Labouchere had famously spearheaded the negotiations for the Louisiana Purchase. His unique blend of French cultural understanding, Dutch banking expertise, and English commercial ties proved precisely what the firm's wartime predicament demanded. His strategic marriage into the influential Baring family further solidified Hope and Company's position, as he became the son-in-law of Francis Baring. This personal and familial bond between Hope and Company and the Barings deepened their relationship far beyond what a mere commercial partnership could have achieved. In a truly literal sense, the two firms were family. Their interests were intertwined, not just commercially, but also personally. Information flowed effortlessly between them, facilitated by the kinship that bound their leaders as much as any contractual agreement. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, Hope and Company remarkably sustained its role as a financial agent for Russia, a relationship that had served as its most vital continental connection since the 1760s. For much of this period, Russia was either allied with or at war with France, presenting significant complications for a bank simultaneously operating from British soil while managing Russian financial affairs. These complex dilemmas were skillfully navigated through the firm's hallmark: careful, relationship-based management. This core competency enabled them to maintain the trust of all parties involved, achieved through an unwavering combination of discretion, reliability, and the undeniable value of their services. The Congress of Vienna, held in 1814 to 1815, represented the grand diplomatic settlement following Napoleon's ultimate defeat. This pivotal event initiated the gradual restoration of a semblance of commercial normality across Europe. Amsterdam, in particular, recovered some of its former commercial vigor, though it never quite regained the financial supremacy it had enjoyed before the French Revolution. The Amsterdam capital market continued to function, and Hope and Company remained an active participant. However, the true center of gravity in European finance had irrevocably shifted to London. Here, firms like Barings, along with the burgeoning London banking community, had consolidated a dominant position during the war years, an advantage that would prove enduring. Following 1815, Hope and Company returned to Amsterdam, re-establishing its headquarters and diligently working to reconstruct operations that had been severely disrupted by 2 decades of relentless war and occupation. The firm undeniably retained its significance. It continued to arrange government loans, manage the crucial Russian financial relationship, and participate in international capital market transactions, all made possible by its formidable reputation and extensive network. Yet, the world had undergone profound transformations, changes to which the firm's established position had not fully adapted. The fundamental question became whether Hope and Company could carve out a new role in the post-Napoleonic world that genuinely aligned with its former stature. The 19th century, unfortunately, proved to be a challenging period for Hope and Company. Its struggles were not the result of catastrophic missteps, but rather because the very world it was designed to serve evolved in ways that gradually eroded its accumulated, specific advantages. The most pivotal and foundational change was the inexorable shift of Europe's financial heart from Amsterdam to London. This transition, already underway since the late 18th century, was propelled by Britain's Industrial Revolution, its burgeoning global commercial empire, and the maturation of the London capital market from a significant regional exchange into the world's preeminent financial hub. The Napoleonic Wars dramatically accelerated this shift. Amsterdam's occupation and subsequent commercial disruption, juxtaposed with London's relative stability and its central role as the financial engine of the anti-Napoleonic coalition, conferred upon the London market a decisive and ultimately irreversible advantage. Hope and Company was intrinsically an Amsterdam firm. Its foundational relationships, its legal and organizational structure, its investor base, and its cultural identity were all deeply rooted in the Dutch commercial tradition. While it could maintain a London office, collaborate closely with Barings, and engage in London market transactions, it simply could not transplant its entire identity and institutional legacy to London in the way a purely financial enterprise, devoid of deep local ties, might have done. The firm was so thoroughly embedded in Amsterdam that this very rootedness, while making it exceptionally powerful there, concurrently limited its potential elsewhere. A second major transformation was the growing professionalization and institutionalization of banking. The early 19th century marked the significant development of central banking. While the Bank of England had been established in 1694 and existed for over a century, it had not yet fully embraced the comprehensive functions of a modern central bank. The Bank of France, founded by Napoleon in 1800, was still a nascent institution. As these central banks progressively developed their roles as lenders of last resort, regulators of the money supply, and primary managers of government debt, they gradually absorbed functions that had traditionally been performed by private banks like Hope and Company. The arrangement of government loans, once Hope and Company's paramount business, became increasingly formalized and competitive. Governments, too, began developing their own internal capacities for managing debt issuance. Concurrently, the investor base for government bonds expanded significantly. No longer were the Amsterdam or London markets the sole venues for large-scale government borrowing. Consequently, the specialized expertise that had rendered Hope and Company indispensable in the late 18th century became less unique and thus less valuable as the 19th century progressed. Although the firm continued to operate in the post-Napoleonic era, its role gradually evolved from being the primary arranger of transactions to merely a participant in deals orchestrated by others. The Russian relationship, however, remained a cornerstone. Russia continued to borrow heavily in European capital markets throughout the 19th century, and Hope and Company maintained its position as one of the principal intermediaries for Russian government lending. Yet even this vital Russian connection was subject to change, as the Russian government itself developed more sophisticated internal financial capabilities and as London-based banks competed ever more aggressively for this lucrative business. The personal dimension of the firm also underwent a significant shift. Henry Hope had been a figure of extraordinary individual capability, a rare talent whose unique blend of intelligence, keen judgment, and unparalleled relationship skills had made the institution truly formidable. While his successors were undoubtedly competent and well-trained, they were operating within a firm whose competitive advantages had been largely forged by the singular genius of its founder. Sustaining those advantages required a continuous renewal of vision and dynamism that did not always materialize at the necessary level. As the 19th century advanced, the Hope family itself became less directly involved in the firm's daily management. The Labouchere connection, linking the family to the Barings through Pierre César Labouchere's marriage, remained significant, but Labouchere himself eventually retired to England. The management of the Amsterdam operations increasingly transitioned to partners who were more employees and professional managers, rather than proprietors with a direct personal financial stake, the kind of investment that typically fosters the strongest alignment between individual interests and the institution's long-term prosperity. By the mid-19th century, Hope and Company was still engaged in a variety of profitable transactions, but these were of secondary, rather than primary, geopolitical significance. The firm participated in railroad financing, a major infrastructure investment wave of the era, and facilitated government loans for various European states. It steadfastly maintained its Dutch base and its vital connections to the Amsterdam market, operating as a respected and profitable institution. Nevertheless, it was no longer the legendary institution that had brokered the Louisiana Purchase, sustained Russian armies in the field, or served as the indispensable intermediary for transactions that reshaped the global map. The world had fundamentally changed, and the unique position Hope and Company had occupied within the late 18th century financial system was simply no longer available. This was not due to the firm's failure, but because the system itself had evolved beyond the point where a single private bank in Amsterdam could command such unparalleled influence. The firm's decline was graceful, a slow fade rather than a catastrophic collapse. Yet, the story of this decline is not one of failure, but of an institution that had fulfilled its historical purpose and was eventually outpaced by the very modern financial world it helped birth. There was no spectacular failure, no dramatic insolvency, no single moment of ruin. Hope and Company simply grew less important over decades, as the world it had been meticulously built to serve transformed around it. By the late 19th century, it was a respected but no longer dominant participant in European finance, a house with a distinguished history and a solid business, but not the institution European governments instinctively turned to when faced with a financial challenge that no one else could possibly resolve. The 20th century brought further diminishment. The firm, remarkably, continued to exist. It had weathered wars, revolutions, and the literal destruction of its physical environment. A mere secular decline in commercial importance was not going to be its ultimate undoing. However, its operations had become a shadow of their former glory. Hope and Company was eventually absorbed into a larger Dutch banking institution in the 20th century, marking the quiet end of its independent existence as a firm that had, for nearly 2 centuries, been one of the most consequential private financial institutions in the world. This absorption was not heralded by any particular ceremony or public acknowledgement. Its renowned name simply vanished from the Amsterdam financial community with the quiet finality that accompanies the cessation of things that have simply outlived their moment. The history of Hope and Company raises questions that, in a specific way, are more compelling and insightful than the answers it immediately provides. How did a family of Scottish merchants, arriving in Amsterdam with neither significant capital nor an established position in the Dutch commercial world, manage to build an institution that would become the most powerful private bank in Europe within just 2 generations? What precise combination of individual genius, institutional design, and historical circumstances could possibly produce such an outcome? And what does the firm's eventual decline, not a failure, but a gradual fading, reveal about the inherent nature and ultimate limits of institutional power? The first part of the answer lies in the personal. Henry Hope was genuinely exceptional, not in some vague biographical sense, but in specific, documented ways. His memory was legendary. His judgment of creditworthiness, evidenced by the vast array of transactions he orchestrated, was almost consistently accurate. His extraordinary ability to cultivate and maintain relationships across the entire spectrum of European society, from influential Amsterdam merchant families to Russian empresses, British banking partners, and even French revolutionary governments, was unique in ways that cannot be fully explained by training or mere circumstance. In every era, certain individuals possess a specific combination of capabilities that perfectly align with the demands of their moment, yielding outcomes disproportionate to what structural factors alone might predict. Henry Hope was one such individual. The second part of the answer is institutional. Hope and Company, at its zenith, had developed practices and structures that not only amplified individual capabilities, but also made them durable across time and through changes in personnel. Its unwavering commitment to reputation above immediate profit, its willingness to decline business that might compromise the firm's standing, even when the fees were tempting, was a policy that demanded continuous individual discipline to uphold. Yet, once firmly established as the firm's defining characteristic, this commitment became powerfully self-reinforcing. Clients sought out Hope and Company precisely because of its impeccable reputation, meaning that maintaining this reputation was, in a straightforward commercial sense, the firm's most valuable business development activity. Furthermore, the elaborate information network that the firm meticulously constructed, the systematic cultivation of relationships that provided early and accurate intelligence about political, economic, and financial conditions across Europe, represented another institutional capability that proved more enduring than any single individual. This network resided not just in formal structures, but in the relationships themselves, in the mutual obligations and the accumulated trust between Hope and Company and its diverse counterparts in courts, governments, and commercial houses throughout the continent. Individual partners might leave, retire, or pass away, but the invaluable relationships sustained through the institution persisted. The third part of the answer is historical. Hope and Company forged its dominance within a very specific period, roughly spanning 1750 to 1815. During this time, the particular capabilities the firm had cultivated were exceptionally well matched to the unique demands of the European financial system. This era was characterized by governments that urgently needed to borrow on an unprecedented scale, by capital markets that were sufficiently sophisticated to absorb large government loans, but not yet so institutionalized that private intermediaries became obsolete, and by a communication and information environment where the advantages of a well-developed private intelligence network were simply enormous. When this specific historical period drew to a close, as governments developed more sophisticated internal financial management, as the London market asserted its global dominance, and as the telegraph, followed by the telephone, began to erode the information advantages private networks had previously enjoyed, the unique position Hope and Company had so skillfully occupied became less distinct and, consequently, less valuable. The firm was not mistaken in building what it built. It was simply operating in a world that was rapidly moving away from the very conditions that had made its edifice so powerful. The Louisiana Purchase remains the most conspicuous testament to what Hope and Company was capable of at its peak. This monumental transaction demanded every facet of the firm's accumulated expertise, honed over 70 years. The deeply cultivated relationship with the United States government, which had been developing since the 1780s, the accessible relationship with the French government, made possible by Labouchere's strategic position and connections, the crucial partnership with Barings, which provided the vital London dimension of the financing, the firm's unassailable reputation for reliability, which instilled both the American and French governments with the confidence to entrust it with a transaction of such sensitivity, and the sheer technical financial creativity to devise a structure that simultaneously resolved all the contradictory requirements. In 1803, no other institution in the world could have arranged the Louisiana Purchase. This is not hyperbole. The specific combination of relationships, reputation, access to capital, and technical capability required for that transaction existed at the necessary level only within Hope and Company and its strategic partnership with Barings. In essence, the United States is the size it is today, in part because a family of Scottish merchants successfully built a banking house in Amsterdam that was so exceptionally proficient at its work that it was the only institution capable of orchestrating the deal when the historic moment arrived. This represents a form of historical causation that standard accounts of the Louisiana Purchase often underemphasize. This isn't because historians are oblivious to it, but because the intricate financial mechanics of 18th century banking are genuinely challenging to convey vividly to a general audience. Moreover, the narrative of Jefferson's vision, Napoleon's decision, and Monroe and Livingston's improvisation is intrinsically more dramatic than the story of bond issuance, discount rates, and the meticulous management of counterparty risk. Yet, the financial narrative is the real story in the sense that it describes how the transaction actually unfolded, how the conceptual agreement between governments was translated into the physical transfer of territory through the sophisticated mechanism of capital market finance. The ideas belonged to Jefferson and Napoleon. The execution belonged to Hope and Company. The broader legacy of Hope and Company is subtly visible within the very financial architecture of the modern world. Although the connection is rarely acknowledged, the practices the firm helped develop and systematize, the sophisticated use of bond markets to finance government operations, the essential role of private banks as intermediaries between governments and capital markets, the management of credit risk through reputation and relationship rather than purely formal legal enforcement, and the inherently international dimensions of capital market transactions all remain fundamental to the functioning of modern public finance. While the specific financial instruments are different, the regulatory environment has transformed beyond recognition, and the communications technology enabling modern financial markets would be utterly incomprehensible to Henry Hope. The underlying logic remains consistent. Governments require borrowing. Private institutions serve as indispensable intermediaries between governments and the capital they need, and the credibility of these institutions fundamentally determines the terms on which governments can access capital. This is the very same logic that Hope and Company was expertly applying in the 1770s. There is also a profound lesson in the firm's decline that warrants serious consideration. Hope and Company did not fail because it made poor decisions or lost its intrinsic capabilities. Rather, it faded because the world around it evolved in ways that rendered its specific capabilities less decisive. The information advantages it had meticulously accumulated became less unique as communications technology dramatically improved. The capital market position it had painstakingly built became less dominant as London unequivocally asserted its supremacy. And the critical government relationships it had cultivated became less essential as governments themselves developed increasingly sophisticated internal financial expertise. This pattern recurs throughout business history and carries a genuine implication. The capabilities that enable an institution to achieve dominance in one era are rarely the same capabilities that will sustain that dominance through the subsequent transitions between eras. Hope and Company was perfectly engineered for the world of the late 18th century and was extraordinarily successful at serving that world. However, it was less well-positioned to lead the transition into the 19th century, and its history after 1815 clearly reflects this. The institution that orchestrated the Louisiana Purchase, that kept Russian armies funded through 3 decades of continental warfare, that served as the indispensable intermediary for the financial transactions of the European great powers at the very zenith of their rivalry, that institution unquestionably deserves to be far better known than it is. It operated for nearly a century at the very heart of the financial architecture that shaped the modern world. It did so with a rare combination of personal integrity, acute commercial intelligence, and institutional sophistication that has seldom been matched. It was, in the fullest commercial sense of the word, a house of hope. not in the sentimental meaning of that phrase, but in the specific commercial meaning, an institution that made possible transactions that would not otherwise have occurred. It converted the grand aspirations of governments and individuals into the concrete reality of capital flows and bond settlements, serving as the essential mechanism through which the possible became actual. The boy from Scotland, who arrived in Amsterdam with no particular advantage and proceeded to build the most powerful private bank in Europe, left behind an institution that outlived him by a century and a legacy that has endured far longer than the institution itself. The money moved, the territory changed hands, the country doubled in size, and somewhere in the meticulous counting houses of Amsterdam, the accounting was done. To truly comprehend what Hope & Company built, one must understand the intricate mechanics of trust in the 18th century financial world. This was not trust as an abstract virtue, but trust as a precisely engineered commercial product, deliberately constructed, meticulously maintained through specific practices, and strategically deployed in ways that consistently generated returns measurable in guilders and florins. The central problem of international finance in the pre-telegraph, pre-institutional era was effective verification. When a merchant in Amsterdam agreed to lend money to the government of Sweden, for instance, he possessed no independent means of definitively verifying the claims the Swedish government made about its revenues, its military situation, its political stability, or its genuine intention to repay. The documents a government submitted in support of a borrowing request were, in principle, whatever that government chose them to be. The information environment was radically asymmetric. The borrower knew vastly more about its own condition than any lender could possibly discover from the outside. This profound information asymmetry was the fundamental challenge of the business, and Hope & Company's groundbreaking solution to it was the development of what would today be called a due diligence process. This was a systematic method of assessing creditworthiness that extended far beyond the official documents a government provided, incorporating intelligence meticulously gathered through the firm's extensive network of relationships, correspondents, and agents stationed across Europe. This network was, unequivocally, the key. Henry Hope and his predecessors had spent decades carefully cultivating relationships with individuals strategically positioned to observe at close range the intricate financial and political conditions of the governments that came to them seeking funds. Amsterdam, seeking funds. Imagine a diplomat stationed in Stockholm, closely observing political tides. A merchant in St. Petersburg, supplying the Russian court, held valuable insights into the empire's internal workings. A military contractor in Vienna possessed intimate knowledge of the actual functioning of the Austrian war budget, a critical piece of financial intelligence. Similarly, a banker in Hamburg, managing the intricate financial flows of the Baltic trade, had an unusually precise grasp of the economic health of the northern European states. These crucial relationships were carefully cultivated and maintained through the established social and commercial channels of the era. This included extensive correspondence, reciprocal referrals for business, the strategic exchange of commercial favors, and occasional personal visits, when the significance of a particular connection warranted the considerable expense and time commitment of travel. The individuals forming this extensive network were not clandestine operatives or paid informants in any formal sense. They were commercial acquaintances, trusted business partners, and personal friends. While their communications with Hope & Company primarily revolved around business matters, the depth of their commercial knowledge inherently served as a vital form of intelligence regarding the broader economic and political conditions in which they operated. The intelligence gathered through this sophisticated network was not merely collected, it was processed by Hope & Company's partners in a manner remarkably systematic for the period. The firm diligently maintained meticulous records, meticulously tracking the performance of previous loans. This included noting which governments had honored their payments promptly, which had been slow to repay, and which had necessitated renegotiation. Crucially, they also documented the specific circumstances that had accompanied each deviation from the agreed-upon terms. Over decades, this practice led to the development of an empirical database detailing sovereign creditworthiness. This internal ledger was far more reliable than any information obtainable from official government sources, precisely because it was founded on observed, actual behavior rather than on self-serving governmental presentations. While this repository of knowledge was never formalized into what a modern risk analyst would recognize as a credit model, its essence resided in the collective memory of the firm's partners, in the detailed letters and ledgers that constituted the firm's records, and in the acute judgment accumulated from years of direct experience with the complex realities of sovereign finance. The practical and profound consequence of this superior information was that Hope and Company's assessments of a borrower's creditworthiness proved more accurate, more consistently, than those of its competitors. This unparalleled accuracy directly translated into a significant commercial advantage. The firm gained the ability to price risk with far greater precision, which meant it could offer more favorable terms to genuinely creditworthy borrowers. Conversely, it could prudently decline business that, while appearing attractive, carried risks that less informed competitors might unknowingly embrace. Naturally, creditworthy borrowers gravitated towards Hope and Company because they received superior terms. Less creditworthy borrowers were forced to seek financing elsewhere. Consequently, the performance of Hope and Company's loan portfolio, that is, the rate at which its borrowers actually repaid their debts, was consistently better than the market average. This stellar performance reinforced the firm's reputation, which in turn attracted even more creditworthy borrowers. This influx generated even better information about prevailing credit conditions, thereby enhancing the next generation of lending decisions. This virtuous cycle was inherently self-reinforcing, precisely in the manner that true competitive advantage often manifests. Hope and Company's most profound contribution to the history of finance was not merely any single landmark transaction, not even the renowned Louisiana Purchase itself. Rather, it was the pivotal role the firm played in developing the fundamental techniques and practices that would define the international government bond market during the critical period of the mid to late 18th century. Prior to the emergence of the Amsterdam bond market, government borrowing in Europe was predominantly a bilateral affair. A government in need of capital would directly approach a wealthy individual or a small consortium of merchants. They would negotiate specific terms and receive cash in exchange for a promise to repay the principal with interest. The terms of these agreements varied enormously, depending on the specifics of the negotiation, the personal relationships involved, and the prevailing power dynamics between the borrower and the lender. These transactions were inherently private, opaque, and incredibly difficult to replicate efficiently at scale. The Amsterdam market introduced a fundamentally different approach. Instead of relying on a single lender or a limited consortium, the Amsterdam model centered on selling bonds to a broad base of individual investors. These were the numerous Dutch savers who had accumulated significant capital through their participation in the dynamic trading economy of the Dutch Golden Age, and who were now seeking returns on that capital that surpassed what they could earn from commercial activity alone. This innovative distribution of lending across a multitude of investors effectively resolved the inherent scale problem. No single individual needed to commit more capital than they were comfortable with, and the total amount that could be raised was limited only by the collective appetite of the Amsterdam investing public for the specific bond being offered. Hope and Company stood as the central institution through which this groundbreaking system operated. The firm meticulously assessed the creditworthiness of the borrowing government, negotiated the terms of the loan, expertly structured the bond issue, and then successfully placed it with investors. Furthermore, Hope and Company managed the ongoing relationship between the borrowing government and the investor community, handling all the complex mechanics of interest payments and the eventual principal repayment. In exchange for these comprehensive services, the firm earned fees that were, in aggregate, very substantial. However, these fees represented genuine value because the alternative wasn't simply the same transaction at a lower cost. Often, the alternative was no transaction at all. The bond structures that Hope and Company developed and diligently refined over decades of practical application were, in their essential features, the direct ancestors of the government bond instruments that remain operational in the modern world. Key characteristics, such as periodic interest payments, defined maturities, publicly stated terms, and the transferability of the instrument in a secondary market, all trace their lineage back to these innovations. These features, which now seem entirely obvious and standard to any modern observer, were pioneering developments that had to be conceived, rigorously tested, and painstakingly refined through actual transactions in real-world markets. Hope and Company was undeniably the institution at the epicenter of this transformative developmental process. Its partners were, in the most literal sense, inventing modern government finance as they navigated their daily business. Through continuous practice, they discovered which financial structures were effective and which were not, which terms successfully attracted investors and which proved unappealing. They also identified which disclosure requirements were genuinely necessary to maintain investor confidence and which constituted unnecessary burdens. The invaluable accumulated learning from this iterative process was deeply embedded in the firm's established practices, its standard contract forms, its enduring relationships with the Amsterdam investor community, and the profound institutional knowledge held by its partners. This truly was pioneering work, even if the individuals involved did not consciously perceive themselves as financial innovators. They saw themselves simply as diligent merchants and bankers conducting their daily business. Yet, the cumulative effect of their pragmatic experimentation was the creation of a sophisticated set of financial instruments and market practices that have, in their essential structure, endured for more than 2 centuries. While we have examined the mechanics of the firm's rise and fall, a full accounting of its legacy requires us to look past the balance sheets and address the grim reality of what truly funded these operations. Any truly honest account of Hope and Company must address a dimension of the firm's history that celebratory narratives, often focused on its role in the Louisiana Purchase and Russian finance, tend to minimize or even entirely omit its involvement in the financing of the Atlantic slave trade. The Dutch Republic's vast commercial empire of the 17th century was substantially built upon the slave trade. The brutal, forced transportation of millions of Africans across the Atlantic to toil on the sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations of the Caribbean and the Americas. The Dutch West India Company was a prominent slave trading organization of that century, and Amsterdam's immense commercial prosperity was directly linked to the revenues generated by slave-based plantation agriculture in its colonies. By the 18th century, the period during which Hope and Company was actively building its banking business, the direct slave trade itself was somewhat less central to Dutch commerce than it had been in the preceding century. British and French traders had, by the mid-18th century, become dominant in the Atlantic slave trade. However, the financing of plantation agriculture in the Caribbean, which relied entirely on enslaved labor, remained a profoundly important component of Amsterdam's commercial and financial activities. The precise nature of Hope and Company's involvement in this slave trade adjacent finance is a complex matter of ongoing historical research. However, beneath the veneer of legitimate trade and sovereign lending, the archival evidence reveals a much darker reality. For decades, the exact extent of Hope and Company's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was brushed off as a marginal byproduct of the era. But recent independent investigations into their archives have unearthed a ledger of blood, revealing that the firm was actually a pivotal player in financing the international slavery economy. By 1770, a staggering 1/4 to 1/3 of the bank's entire revenues were generated directly from slavery-related activities. They weren't just passively trading sugar and coffee, they were systematically pricing human lives. Between 1770 and 1780, approximately 4,500 enslaved men, women, and children across at least 50 plantations in the Caribbean were simultaneously pawned as human collateral for loans administered by Hope and Company. And when the 19th century arrived and European nations began turning their backs on slavery, the bank simply shifted its focus and doubled down on human suffering. Looking across the Atlantic to the American South, Hope and Company purchased $7 million worth of bonds from the Citizens Bank of Louisiana between 1836 and 1842, providing the working capital for a bank explicitly established to finance the massive expansion of slave plantations. The dehumanization was chillingly direct. In 1840, they issued a loan to an American politician, directly accepting 203 enslaved people at the Oswechee Bend plantation in Alabama as collateral, meticulously appending a list of their names to the contract. As the calls for abolition grew louder, the bank's leadership did not quietly step away or express regret. Instead, figures like partner Samuel Pierre Labouchere signed petitions demanding maximum financial compensation from the government for the so-called loss of their human property. The glittering capital that built Hope and Company's formidable reputation was, undeniably, built upon the forced labor and commodification of thousands of lives. Acknowledging this context does not diminish the specific achievements of Hope and Company in arranging the Louisiana Purchase or in pioneering the techniques of government bond finance. Instead, it places those achievements within a fuller, more truthful historical framework, one that standard accounts, often focusing solely on the diplomatic and financial ingenuity of these transactions, tend to overlook or downplay. The House of Hope was constructed and thrived within a world whose commercial foundations were deeply entangled with one of the most egregious crimes in human history. Understanding that pervasive context is an essential part of comprehending the firm's true nature and impact. This sobering reality of how the firm's capital was sourced, often from the forced labor of the enslaved, must be held in tension with the sophisticated mechanisms of intelligence and trust they pioneered. Chapter 8: The 18th Century Intelligence Machine. In the pre-telegraphic world, information was far more than merely useful. It was the primary wellspring of commercial advantage in international trade and finance. A shrewd merchant or banker who knew the price of pepper in Batavia 2 weeks before his competitors possessed an ability to execute trades that were effectively risk-free. A banker privy to a government's borrowing plans before any public announcement could strategically position himself to secure that business on highly favorable terms. Hope and Company had dedicated decades to meticulously constructing what was, in effect, one of the most sophisticated private information systems in all of Europe. The firm's expansive correspondence network stretched across the entire continent and beyond, reaching agents in major commercial cities, cultivating contacts within diplomatic circles, and engaging trading partners in far-flung regions such as Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and the Americas. The sheer volume of correspondence that flowed through the firm's offices on the Keizersgracht in Amsterdam was, by the standards of the era, truly extraordinary. The letters that have survived in archives, a mere fraction of what was originally written, given the inevitable losses due to time, war, and institutional transitions, reveal a picture of information management that was genuinely sophisticated. The partners of Hope and Company did not simply receive information passively. They actively cultivated specific correspondence for specific purposes. They carefully shaped the questions they asked to elicit precisely the information they needed, rigorously cross-checking intelligence received from one source against that obtained from others. Over time, they developed a finely calibrated sense of which correspondence were reliably accurate and which tended to either overstate or understate the conditions they reported on. The most valuable intelligence concerned political matters, the intentions of governments, the stability of various regimes, and the likelihood of war or peace in specific regions. A banker who knew, before the broader markets, that a particular conflict was about to conclude could acquire bonds that the market had mistakenly priced for continued warfare, realizing substantial profits. Similarly, a banker aware that a government was on the brink of default could liquidate bonds before the default became public knowledge, thereby averting significant losses. The commercial value of this kind of political intelligence was immense. Hope and Company's privileged position at the nexus of European government finance granted it access to political information of a quality rarely available to other private institutions. The firm exercised meticulous caution in how it leveraged this sensitive information. There was a delicate, yet crucial line between utilizing superior information to make better commercial decisions, which was an entirely accepted business practice, and manipulating markets or acting on genuinely privileged governmental information in ways that constituted a breach of the trust governments had placed in the firm. Crossing this line was both ethically problematic and commercially perilous, as it risked destroying the very relationships that generated the information advantage in the first place. This was a boundary that the most sophisticated operators understood exceptionally well. Henry Hope, in particular, appears to have grasped this distinction with unusual clarity. Evidence suggests he was scrupulously meticulous in maintaining the confidentiality of specific information shared with him within a governmental context, even when utilizing that information would have been significantly commercially advantageous. This deliberate maintenance of boundaries was not an act of altruism. It was a strategic commercial decision that preserved the integrity of the relationships providing the information. Advantage. A government that discovered its confidences had been violated would understandably cease sharing sensitive information. Without those confidences, the invaluable information advantage would simply vanish. This represented a form of reputation management that operated at a far more sophisticated level than the simple maintenance of creditworthiness. It was the careful management of an information relationship, the deliberate cultivation of a position as a trusted confidant of governments, which demanded demonstrating through consistent, trustworthy behavior over time that their trust was genuinely warranted. The ultimate payoff for this long-term investment in trustworthiness was unparalleled access to lucrative transactions, to invaluable intelligence, and to critical relationships that were simply unavailable to any institution that had not made the same profound, long-term commitment to integrity. Institutions, of course, do not build themselves. Hope and Company's century of dominance was the direct result of a specific sequence of remarkable individuals whose capabilities were exceptionally well suited to the demands of the firm's unique business at the precise historical moments they occupied. Thomas Hope, the founder, was precisely the right person to establish the firm in Amsterdam in the early 18th century. This was a period when Dutch commercial culture was open to new entrants, when the commodity trading networks that formed the firm's original business were genuinely profitable, and when the foundational relationships that would eventually evolve into the government finance business were just beginning to be forged. By all available evidence, he was a competent and reliable merchant of a kind that Amsterdam boasted many. The foundation he laid was solid, but the magnificent edifice that would be constructed upon it was not yet fully visible. Henry Hope emerged as the truly transformative figure, the visionary who fully grasped what the firm could become and possessed the precise combination of capabilities required to realize that potential. His 50 years of active management, spanning roughly the 1760s to the early 1800s, perfectly coincided with the period of the firm's greatest power. This era saw the development of every major relationship and capability that would define Hope and Company at its absolute zenith. Pierre César Labouchere, in turn, was the ideal individual for navigating the tumultuous Napoleonic transition. He was a figure uniquely capable of operating with extraordinary complexity between warring powers. His personal background, his extensive family connections, and his specific skill set granted him unparalleled access to all sides of a conflict that most institutions could only manage by reluctantly choosing allegiance with one. His pivotal role in the Louisiana Purchase transaction was precisely that which his singular position made possible: the seamless coordination between Amsterdam, Paris, and London that no other individual or institution in European finance could have managed with the same facility. The partners who managed the firm after Henry Hope's death in 1811 were undoubtedly competent professionals. They skillfully maintained the institution through the challenging post-Napoleonic transition. What they did not provide, however, was the kind of transformative individual capability that had so powerfully driven the firm's development during its greatest period. This should not be viewed as a failure on their part. Transformative capability of Henry Hope's caliber is exceptionally rare in any generation. Its absence is, in fact, the normal condition of institutions, rather than the exception. The firm also relied on something rarely discussed in accounts of Hope and Company: a substantial staff of clerks, accountants, and administrative personnel whose anonymous, tireless labor made the partners' elevated work possible. The voluminous correspondence that built and maintained the firm's vital information network had to be meticulously written, copied, and dispatched. The intricate accounts that tracked the firm's enormous volume of financial transactions had to be maintained with an unwavering precision that allowed no room for error. The complex legal documentation for bond issues, loan agreements, and commission structures had to be drafted with absolute accuracy. All of this essential work was performed by people whose names, for the most part, do not appear in the historical record, but whose collective effort was as fundamentally essential to the firm's operations as the sagacious judgment of the partners themselves. This intricate interplay represents the true human architecture of a great institution: the combination of exceptional individual capability at the very top, solid professional competence in the middle tiers, and the anonymous but utterly essential labor of the many people who ensured the daily operations functioned flawlessly. Hope and Company possessed all three of these elements in sufficient measure during its greatest period, enabling it to produce results that would have been utterly impossible had any one of these three components been absent. Historical counterfactuals are inherently speculative exercises. The world is a complex system in which the removal of even a single element irrevocably alters everything that follows in ways that are impossible to trace with absolute certainty. However, posing the counterfactual question, what would have happened to the Louisiana Purchase if Hope and Company had not existed to arrange its financing? Is a valuable endeavor because the answer vividly illuminates the firm's actual pivotal role. The most straightforward answer is that the purchase would have been delayed, probably significantly, and might not have ultimately occurred on the terms it actually did. The specific problem that Hope and Company so brilliantly solved, converting American government bonds into immediately usable cash for France within a narrow window of political opportunity, situated between the Peace of Amiens and the renewal of Anglo-French hostilities, demanded a combination of capabilities that existed in very few, if any, other institutions. Baring Brothers could certainly have arranged some elements of the transaction from London. However, Baring's position in Paris was less developed than Hope and Company's, thanks to Labouchere's crucial connections. Furthermore, Baring's access to the Amsterdam market was dependent on Hope and Company's cooperation, rather than being an independent capability. Without Hope and Company, Baring Brothers could not have arranged the entire transaction alone. The major French banking houses could have handled some of the Paris side dimensions, but they critically lacked both the necessary Amsterdam market access and the specialized American creditworthiness assessment capabilities that such a transaction demanded. French banks in 1803 possessed limited capacity to place American government bonds with European investors because they lacked the established relationships with American financial institutions and the proven track record of American sovereign assessment that Hope and Company had painstakingly accumulated through its earlier American financial activities. American banks in 1803 were still developing institutions, genuinely capable within the domestic market, but entirely without the European connections and the sovereign credit assessment experience that a transaction of this complexity required. Even the Bank of the United States, the most sophisticated American financial institution of the era, could not have single-handedly arranged the European dimensions of the Louisiana financing from Philadelphia. The most plausible counterfactual outcome, therefore, is that the Louisiana Purchase would have been delayed by months, or quite possibly years, while alternative, less efficient financing arrangements were painstakingly assembled. In such a delay, the volatile political situation in Europe, specifically the likely renewal of Anglo-French hostilities, might very well have rendered the entire transaction impossible. Britain, at war with France, would have possessed much stronger grounds to object vehemently to any financial transaction that injected cash directly into Napoleon's hands. The political pressure on American banks or neutral European banks to avoid facilitating such a transaction would have been intense and potentially insurmountable. Napoleon, facing a renewed war with Britain without the immediate cash infusion provided by the Louisiana sale, might have entirely reconsidered the sale, or might have demanded a prohibitively higher price that the United States, with its limited fiscal capacity, simply could not have met. The Louisiana Territory might thus have remained French until the military situation resolved itself one way or another, perhaps through British seizure, American expansion by other means, or some diplomatic settlement that produced an entirely different outcome than the one that actually occurred. None of this would necessarily have meant a permanently smaller United States. American expansion westward had an undeniable momentum that eventually would have addressed the question of Louisiana, regardless of what transpired in 1803. But the specific timing, the specific terms, and the specific mechanism of its acquisition would have been irrevocably altered. The intricate specifics of the Louisiana Purchase, its precise timing, favorable terms, and the very mechanism of its acquisition were fundamentally sculpted by Hope and Company's unparalleled ability to orchestrate the financing within the narrow, fleeting window of opportunity. Indeed, a counterfactual analysis powerfully argues that the transaction, in the form it ultimately took, was as much a testament to Hope and Company's unique financial capabilities as it was to Thomas Jefferson's visionary foresight or Napoleon's strategic decision. The sophisticated practices that Hope and Company meticulously developed and refined throughout its century of preeminence in European government finance did not simply vanish with the firm's eventual decline. Instead, these groundbreaking methodologies were deeply absorbed into the burgeoning broader financial system, eagerly adopted by influential entities like the Barings and other leading banking houses of the 19th century. They became institutionalized within the nascent central banks and were eventually formalized into the robust legal and regulatory frameworks that underpin modern public finance. The modern government bond market, for instance, that crucial mechanism through which national governments efficiently borrow capital from investors by issuing securities promising periodic interest payments and the return of principal at maturity, is a direct and undeniable descendant of the innovative Amsterdam bond market that Hope and Company was instrumental in developing. Whether we consider the vast United States Treasury bond market, the venerable British gilt market, the German Bund market, or the Italian BTP market, all these diverse systems, in their essential structure, are sophisticated contemporary versions of what Hope and Company pioneered in the 1770s and 1780s. While operating today at scales and with technological sophistication that would have been utterly incomprehensible to Henry Hope himself, they nonetheless function on precisely the same fundamental financial logic. Similarly, the indispensable role of the investment bank as the vital intermediary connecting government borrowers with the investing public, a role encompassing critical functions like assessing creditworthiness, meticulously structuring complex transactions, expertly placing securities with a diverse investor base, and diligently managing the ongoing relationship is also a direct descendant of Hope and Company's foundational business model. When Goldman Sachs orchestrates a sovereign bond issue for an emerging market government in 2024, it is, in its essential commercial logic, performing the same fundamental service that Hope and Company provided for nations like Russia and Sweden in 1780. While the financial instruments are distinct, the scale is vastly different, and the regulatory environment has entirely transformed. The underlying commercial relationship and the informational and reputational dynamics that structure it remain recognizably identical. The rigorous due diligence process that Hope and Company pioneered, a systematic assessment of sovereign creditworthiness meticulously conducted through a judicious combination of official documentation and invaluable private intelligence, stands as the direct ancestor of the sophisticated credit rating processes performed today by agencies like Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. Modern credit rating agencies have formalized, institutionalized, and imbued with technical sophistication what Hope and Company achieved through astute personal relationships and seasoned judgment. Yet, the fundamental problem they are endeavoring to solve and the core approach they employ to address it would have been instantly recognizable to any partner of Hope and Company. Furthermore, the expansive information network that Hope and Company meticulously constructed, a sophisticated system of correspondence, agents, and deep-seated relationships that consistently provided early and remarkably accurate intelligence regarding political and economic conditions across the European continent, is the direct ancestor of the intricate economic and political intelligence operations that major financial institutions diligently maintain today. Whether it's Bloomberg's global network of financial journalists and data collectors, the formidable research departments of leading investment banks, or the specialized geopolitical risk consultancies that advise financial institutions on sovereign credit conditions, all of these, in their essential function, represent modern, technologically enhanced versions of what Hope and Company accomplished through its vital correspondence network in the 18th century. Paradoxically, none of these modern institutions would likely acknowledge Hope and Company as their direct ancestor. The historical connection is perhaps too remote, the institutional memory too short-lived, and the specific history of the firm itself too obscure for widespread recognition. Yet, the connection is undeniably genuine. The sophisticated financial architecture of the modern world was not conceived in a single moment of brilliant insight. Rather, it evolved incrementally, piece by painstaking piece, through the invaluable practical experience of pioneering institutions like Hope and Company. These firms were relentlessly solving real-world problems with the limited tools available to them, and through iterative practice and persistent effort, they discovered which solutions proved effective and which ultimately failed. The House of Hope, therefore, stands as one of the seminal locations where this crucial developmental work took place. It was one of the foremost institutions that, through decades of relentless practical experience, transformed the nascent, emerging practices of international capital market finance into something sufficiently robust and reliable to become the very foundation of the modern financial system. Ultimately, the enduring story of Hope and Company is a profound narrative about the intricate relationship between individual capability, astute institutional design, and opportune historical circumstance, and, crucially, what remarkable outcomes can materialize when all three elements align perfectly, synergistically producing an achievement that far exceeds what any single component could have generated independently. Henry Hope himself was, without question, an exceptional individual. However, even the most brilliant individuals, without the crucial institutional context that permits their unique capabilities to be deployed at scale and meticulously preserved across the expanse of time, inevitably produce outcomes that are destined to vanish with their passing. A merchant genius who amasses a vast fortune purely through personal relationships and singular individual judgment, but who ultimately fails to construct an enduring institution capable of functioning effectively after his death, leaves behind a legacy that, at best, endures for a single generation. In stark contrast, Hope and Company persevered for nearly 2 centuries. It achieved such remarkable longevity, not because every subsequent partner who guided its operations was as singularly exceptional as Henry Hope. Indeed, it is clear that none were. Rather, it endured because the profoundly effective institutional practices that Henry Hope had meticulously developed, including an unwavering commitment to reputation above immediate profit, the systematic cultivation of its invaluable information network, the meticulous management of its relationships with borrowing governments, and the careful, strategic selection of transactions in which to participate were so deeply embedded within the firm's operational DNA that they successfully survived the critical transition from his transformative leadership to the next generation and the generation after that. This, fundamentally, is what it truly means to build something that lasts, not to simply create a structure utterly dependent on a continuous stream of individual genius for its daily operation, but instead to thoughtfully develop robust practices, enduring norms, and resilient relationships that function exceptionally well, even when the individuals who operate them are merely competent rather than truly exceptional. The truly great institutions, it can be argued, are not those that demand greatness from every single individual involved in their functioning. Rather, they are the ones that have been so exquisitely designed that ordinary competence, when thoughtfully applied within well-conceived systems, consistently produces extraordinary results. Hope and Company masterfully achieved this remarkable feat for nearly a century. Its eventual, graceful decline reflected not a fundamental failure of its core design, but rather the stark reality that even the most brilliantly designed institutions eventually confront unforeseen circumstances. Profound technological change, fierce competitive disruption, and dramatic geopolitical transformations that their original design simply could not anticipate and therefore cannot accommodate without a fundamental, often radical, reconstruction. The kind of sweeping reconstruction that would have permitted Hope and Company to retain its dominance in the rapidly evolving 19th century financial world, a strategic relocation to London, for instance, or a fundamental reconception of its very role in a world where the Amsterdam market was no longer paramount, would have demanded a level of institutional self-transformation that is genuinely rare. The firm, instead, opted for a gradual, pragmatic accommodation to its significantly reduced circumstances. While that choice was undeniably commercially rational, it was also, ultimately, the choice that brought its extraordinary story to a close. Ultimately, the House of Hope constructed far more than a mere banking business. It meticulously crafted an enduring template for how private institutions could operate effectively at the vital intersection of commerce and statecraft. This template demonstrated how a bank could function as the indispensable mechanism through which the ambitious visions of governments are expertly converted into practical reality, all while scrupulously maintaining the independence and unimpeachable reputations that rendered it genuinely useful and trustworthy to all participating parties. That very template, though it has adapted and evolved over centuries beyond immediate recognition, still profoundly shapes the intricate financial architecture of the modern world. Its name may have largely faded into obscurity, but its core practices, its enduring methodologies, persist. This, perhaps, is the most honest and profound measure of what a truly great institution genuinely achieves, not merely the preservation of its own name, but rather the tenacious persistence and pervasive influence of the fundamental principles and solutions it successfully pioneered. The grand counting houses that once lined the Keizersgracht are long gone. The intricate bills of exchange they once processed have long since been settled and forgotten. The very bonds that Hope and Company meticulously placed with discerning Amsterdam investors have been redeemed with interest for over 2 centuries. The Louisiana territory they financed ultimately blossomed into 15 states. The Russian Empire they helped sustain through finance collapsed amidst revolution. The formidable British Empire, whose complex finances they navigated with such careful dexterity, is now primarily a historical memory. Yet, somewhere deep within the intricate structure of the modern financial system, within the sophisticated operations of bond markets, in the rigorous due diligence processes, in the critical sovereign credit assessments, and in the fundamental relationships that define interactions between private banks and sovereign borrowers, the profound accumulated learning of the House of Hope quietly persists. It remains anonymous and largely unacknowledged, serving as the silent, indispensable foundation for countless financial mechanisms that most people utilize daily without ever knowing their true origins. That, indeed, is a remarkable legacy. And it was patiently constructed over a century by a family of industrious Scottish merchants who arrived in Amsterdam with little more than their sharp intelligence, unyielding integrity, and an indefatigable willingness to work. Thus, we have meticulously traced the full, sweeping arc of the House of Hope. From Thomas Hope's initial arrival in Amsterdam in the early 18th century, through the extraordinary decades of Henry Hope's unparalleled dominance, encompassing pivotal events like the Louisiana Purchase and the tumultuous Napoleonic Wars, and continuing through the firm's long, graceful decline throughout the 19th century, culminating in its quiet absorption that marked the end of its independent existence. The story of Hope and Company is, at its most fundamental level, a profound narrative about trust. Not trust in the ephemeral, sentimental, or psychological sense, but rather trust understood as a tangible commercial asset, something that can be painstakingly built, diligently maintained, strategically deployed, and regrettably, eventually depleted in ways that carry very concrete financial consequences. The firm's remarkable ascent was primarily driven by its exceptional ability to render itself supremely trustworthy in a volatile and uncertain environment where trust was inherently scarce and, consequently, immensely valuable. Its eventual decline reflected, in part, the profound reality that the broader financial system had, over time, developed its own robust institutional mechanisms for establishing trust, thereby rendering the specific, deeply relationship-based trust that Hope and Company offered less uniquely valuable in a changing landscape. The Louisiana Purchase, while certainly significant, occupies a central position within this narrative, not because it necessarily represented the most lucrative transaction the firm ever orchestrated, it likely was not, but precisely because it most comprehensively and brilliantly demonstrated the full spectrum of what the firm was truly capable of when all its formidable capabilities were perfectly aligned with an opportunity of the first order. This monumental transaction demanded every facet of Hope and Company's considerable strengths: its unparalleled network of relationships, its sterling reputation, its technical creativity in structuring complex finance, its acute political sensitivity, its indispensable partnership with Barings, and, not least, the personal courage required to commit to a deal of such magnitude and sensitivity amidst conditions of extreme political uncertainty. The enduring modern relevance of Hope and Company's story is not solely or even primarily about banking, though the banking lessons it offers are undeniably real and profoundly instructive. Rather, it speaks to the specific, critical role that financial intermediaries play in the global arena, translating grand political possibility into tangible, practical reality. It illuminates how they make possible the ambitious undertakings that governments and individuals aspire to, but cannot accomplish without sophisticated mechanisms that effectively convert aspiration into deployable capital and capital into decisive action. The Louisiana Purchase was indeed Thomas Jefferson's bold vision and Napoleon's strategic decision. But, crucially, it was Hope and Company's transaction. Without the bank, that ambitious vision and decisive agreement would have remained, at best, a mere understanding between two governments, utterly lacking the practical financial mechanism to implement it. With the bank's pivotal involvement, however, they coalesced into the largest peaceful territorial acquisition in recorded history, the singular event that definitively set the physical boundaries of the United States on its eventual continental scale. The House of Hope, then, built something truly monumental, an institution that endured for nearly 2 centuries and profoundly shaped the world in ways its original founders, arriving in Amsterdam with little more than sharp commercial intelligence and an unflagging willingness to work, could never possibly have imagined. The institution's distinctive name has, regrettably, largely disappeared from public memory. Yet, the far-reaching consequences of what it accomplished are visibly woven into the fabric of our modern world, manifest in the very size and expanse of the United States, in the sophisticated architecture of public finance, and in the fundamental patterns of international capital market activity that continue to structure how governments borrow and how investors lend globally. That, truly, is a legacy worth remembering. And it all began, as the most unexpected legacies often do, with the determined family of Scottish merchants who ventured to Amsterdam precisely because Amsterdam was the undisputed center of global capital, and who, through sheer talent and tireless effort, proved to be better at handling that capital than almost anyone else in the history of financial intermediation.